Hey, this is Joe from Home Studio Corner. I got this question over on YouTube from Ghost, aka 10 minus 9 on YouTube. I'm pretty good at math. That's one. Okay, so the main question here is, when sending tracks through a bus, do I then adjust all the levels and plugins through the bus track only, the original tracks only, or both the original tracks and the bus track? So, good question. Let's talk about that. Real quickly, if you're not familiar with what we mean by bus, take a look at this session. This is a pretty big session. It's got 30 plus tracks in it. There's probably more than that when we combine them all. There's a lot going on here, but realistically, I've got it grouped into sections. Each of these sections has a folder, and each folder is represented by a bus. So I'll talk about that in just a second. So when you look in the mix session, this looks like a fairly big session, but when we collapse all these folders, we can see that we really only have a handful of categories of sounds to deal with. We've got drums, bass, electrics, acoustics, keys, strings, vocals, and background vocals. These white tracks over here are my buses, reverbs, delays, and things that I can send some of the signal to add those effects. Okay, the whole folder bus thing for me is helpful in a number of ways, but one of them is to simplify the process so I can think about, yeah, there's 100 tracks here, but it's really just 8 sections. So for here, there's 40, 50 tracks in the song, but really I'm dealing with 8 sections that I have to deal with. Let's get a good drum mix, bass mix, guitar mix, so on and so forth. Now, what's happening here is your system may not have folders. That's not really the point of this. But typically for me, if I've got a bunch of tracks, like let's say these blue drum tracks, I've got them all routed to the drum bus. So the way any system defaults, you create a new track, it sends it to your main output. That's also a bus. But to give ourselves the ability to adjust things separately, we may want to put all of our drums into a drum bus. That gives us a couple of advantages. One, we can now adjust the overall level of the drums by moving the single fader on the bus. The blue faders here are buses, the white faders are channels or tracks. And then it also allows us to put plugins on the bus to put an EQ or a compressor across our entire drum mix. Not so much talking about that today. We're talking about specifically where do we adjust the levels on here. So right here, if we just look at these blue tracks here, we've got a couple of different places where we can adjust the volume. The most obvious, let's look at the kick drum. The first place you might think of is right here on the fader. We can turn it up, we can turn it down. We can also turn things up and down here on the bus. This will turn the kick drum up and down. It'll also turn everything else up and down. And then up here at the top of the channel, we've got this gain knob here that allows us to turn the volume up and down by as much as 24 decibels before it even hits the fader. And then if you have plugins in here, like an EQ plugin that has a volume adjustment, there's more volume being adjusted there. So this is sometimes called gain staging. I don't use that phrase a lot because it means some things that I don't mean when I say that. But for me, here's the way I like to do it. When I first start a session, if you haven't checked out my 5-step mix guide, it talks about this. You can get it at 5stepmix.com. It's completely free. Step 1 is getting the session set up, which involves getting it to this point that you see here with folders and buses. Color-coded, routed properly, ready for you to start mixing. Step 2 is the static mix. So before we add any of these plugins to any of the channels or buses, we're going to spend a good amount of time just setting levels. So for me, I like to start, the way I have my system set up is if I have all the faders at 0 and I hit play, I want to adjust the volume to where it feels fairly balanced without having to go crazy with the faders. So typically what happens, if someone sends me tracks to mix and I have all the faders at 0 and I hit play, it's way too loud. It's clipping my main output. It sounds too loud in my room. And what a lot of people might do is they'll turn their speakers down. I'd rather turn it down in the session. And I'd take it a step further. So let's say these drums were too loud and I say, too loud. I could do this, right? I could pull those faders down. I could also pull the bus fader down and accomplish the net result of making it quieter. But what's the problem with that? Can you see the problem? Let's say I pull these down like this. What happens if I need to adjust the volume of that kick drum a little bit and I want to turn it up? Well, take a look at this number here. It's 40. So it's negative 40. That's how many decibels down from 0 I've turned it down. So these were some really hot drum tracks. And let's say I want to adjust this volume of the kick drum. Well, if I move it up this much on the screen, right? That's not a huge movement of volume or physical movement of the fader, but you can see it's going from like 40 to, what was it doing? It was going up to like 27. So that's like 12 or more dB of volume. That's a doubling of the volume twice, I think. That's a big difference in volume. To do the same amount of volume here, we'd have to go from like here all the way up. So what I'm showing you is faders are typically logarithmic, meaning there's more resolution up here at 0 than there is down here at -36. A tiny movement here could be a huge jump in volume, whereas a tiny movement here is a decimal, 1.1 decibels, right? It's not a huge movement. So for me, I like for my faders to live right around 0. And that means that as I get like the rough, I think about it as like rough levels and then fine levels. I'll get the rough levels in place with all the faders at 0, and then I can adjust the fine levels after that. Is there like does it sound better this way? No, it's a matter of personal preference and taste, and also a matter of keeping, I can keep a consistency here where I don't have this fader way down here and this fader way up here. I can kind of have them all closer at hand, easier to reach, and I can make these fine adjustments a lot easier. So for me, the first place where I adjust the volume isn't on this fader or this fader, it's up here. So years ago, before this input gain section was available in Studio One, which you can turn on if you're using Studio One, you turn that on by turning on input controls here. Before that, I would put a plugin called Mix Tool that was just a volume knob that I would put at the top of all my channels, and I would do this same process. So if the kick drum, for example, these tambourines in this session were too loud at 0, so I turned them down 10 decibels. So instead of turning the fader down, I just yanked down the gain here, and that allowed me to keep the faders here. So later on, as I'm getting the more finer details of my mix, I can say, you know what, let's turn those tambourines up a little bit, and I can do that. And it's a half a decibel movement. Whereas if they were down here and I do that same physical movement, I've moved them like 10 dB, or what was that? Like, look at that. If we're way down here, I'm at -106, I do a little movement, I've jumped up 40 dB. With just a tiny little movement. That's an exaggerated example, but you get the idea. Now, the question of, okay, now we've done that, we've got our rough levels, and I'll do that across the entire session. If we expand these out, you will see just about every channel in here has been adjusted, sometimes dramatically. Like this first pad, I turned it down 16 dB to have it be at a better spot. You'll see I turned down probably some vocals. Yeah, a few of the vocals got turned down as well. And you'll notice as I move across, my faders are all kind of around 0. Maybe that's weird. Maybe that's a weird quirk that I have, but it works well for me. Try it. See if you like it. Now, the difference here is, now that I've got my levels here, my buses, I even am more adamant about trying to keep them at 0 for the most part. And then if I need to adjust, I get through with my first initial mix and I say, man, these drums are too quiet now. I can do this number here. I can just push up that bus fader. If I had pushed it up too early in the beginning, I've got nowhere to push up. And if I had pulled it way down, same problem as before, I don't have enough resolution. So everything kind of the first pass, the faders are roughly at 0. And then this is, I believe this session is my final mix of this song. You can see once I got things set, I didn't move faders very much at all. You can see that I turned all my buses down by 3 decibels. Things were probably getting a little bit loud, so I turned down the input to the bus, which is another place that you can adjust volume. But for the faders, I mostly left them alone. Now, to the original question, I feel like I've danced around the actual question. Do you adjust the levels on one, the bus, the original tracks, or both? And the answer is probably both. So my first pass, I'm going to adjust the levels up here, these kind of rough gain levels. Then I'm going to adjust the levels of these tracks. So I would go through and get the rough level. Let's say we're talking about drums. I get all these levels about right. Then I come in and move these faders to get myself a good drum mix. Now, the only time I adjust this fader is if I want to adjust the overall volume of the drums. So can you see kind of the hierarchy there? This affects everything. This just moves my kick drum. So I really just move what needs to be moved. If I'm listening to the overall mix and I say, if I say, I can't hear the kick drum versus I can't hear the drums, those are two different things, and that's going to determine which one I touch. So if I can't hear the kick drum, let's turn the kick drum up. If I can't hear the drums in general, let's turn the overall drums up. Does that make sense? It's a very simple thing, but the problem with digital systems and really just audio in general is there's so many different ways to just adjust the volume. I've shown you some of them. There are a lot more. Everything from when you're recording to different plugins that you add. So there's lots of ways to mess this up. So I try to keep things simple. I try to keep things at unity. You'll hear that term a lot. When a fader's at 0, that's called unity. That means it's not adding volume or taking volume away. It's just passing it on through. Just a general approach that I've been doing for a long time, and I really like the way it works. Fun fact about this. I first started doing a version of this. This was years ago, 10, 12 years ago. I interviewed a guy named Al Wagner, known as Big Al. He had a recording podcast at the time, and he said one of the things he likes to do when he's recording, so kind of the same idea, is set all the faders on the console at 0 and adjust the gains on the preamp to get the levels right. So if he's recording drums, he's adjusting the gains on the preamp to get his drum mix at the recording. So if you pulled the tracks in and didn't touch a fader, it already sounds pretty mixed. That's a cool idea, and that kind of translated for me into this. So there are times when you're in a recording session where maybe you want to turn the preamp up more than you need in the mix because that preamp gives you a little extra vibe because it's a cool tube preamp, and as you turn it up, it sounds cool. And as long as you're not clipping, I'm happy with that. But in the mix, I don't get any bonus points for having everything as loud as possible in a digital system. There's no benefit there. So I like to keep things at 0 and adjust gains in other places as much as I can. Okay, that was a wordier response than I wanted to make. Let's answer Ghost's second question real quick. What's the difference between applying mastering plugins to the main channel output on a regular session versus doing it on the project page? This is a Studio One question. What's the difference between putting some plugins here on my main output versus putting them on the mix inside of the project page where we do our mastering? The difference is nil. It's the same exact thing. For me, though, I like the separation. I don't want to master in my mixing sessions. I want to have a separate session where I'm just looking at a mix. I'm not looking at 50 tracks, and I'm just mastering that mix, ideally alongside other mixes, so I'm working on those mixes. I've zoomed out further to just work on the mixes, not the individual tracks. Okay, that's it for me. Thanks so much for watching. If you like this, click that little thumbs up somewhere, and that's it. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.